The doorbell rings. Derek, a 16-year-old black teen, stands frozen, his hand still hovering over the door handle, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the heavy footsteps outside send a chill down his spine. His eyes flicker to the window. The same nosy neighbors who have always cast judgmental glares now stand at the end of his driveway. Their faces twisted with suspicion, their fingers pointing in his direction. Derek knows they've been watching, judging and whispering behind his back. The police sirens in the distance grow louder, and his stomach churns. What do they want? He wonders. But before he can think further, the sound of the sirens cuts through the air, drowning out his thoughts. The weight of this moment presses down on him, and he's about to find out just how far people will go when they let prejudice control their actions. Little does he know, the truth of his own identity and his family's life is about to turn their assumptions upside down, in the most shocking way possible. Derek Evans was no stranger to hardship. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he always felt a little different, not because of anything he did, but because of the color of his skin. It was a fact he couldn't change, and for the most part, he had learned to navigate life with the quiet resilience that came with it. Still, every glance, every whispered comment from those around him felt like a sharp reminder that the world didn't always see him for who he truly was. His family lived in a modest home on Pinebrook Avenue, nestled between pristine white fences and freshly trimmed lawns. The houses in the neighborhood were picture perfect, their owners always quick to display the fruits of their hard work. But behind the seemingly serene exterior of his family's home, Derek had always known that things weren't as simple as they appeared. The house itself was small, but full of love. His mother, Marissa, worked long hours as a nurse at the Ida local hospital, always coming home tired but still managing to cook dinner with a smile. His father, Malik, was a school teacher who spent his days mentoring the next generation of young minds. Derek admired him deeply, though he never truly understood the weight of his father's quiet struggles. He knew his parents wanted the best for him, but Derek couldn't ignore the heavy sense of pressure they both carried, the weight of wanting to give their son a life free from the struggles they had faced. They had worked so hard to create a life that seemed as normal as possible, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of reach. The neighborhood was mostly filled with families who had been there for generations. Generations of comfort, of privilege, and of unspoken expectations. The houses all looked the same. Wide front yards with trimmed hedges, flower beds bursting with color, and perfectly manicured lawns. Yet something about the polished appearance felt fake. Beneath the surface, Derek knew it was more of a mask than a reflection of reality. But that wasn't what worried him the most. What worried Derek most was the growing tension he could feel in the air, especially from the neighbors on his left, the Lamberts. The Lamberts, with their spotless white garage door and their perfectly aligned rows of flowers, had always seemed to have it all together. Mr. Lambert worked as a lawyer, and Mrs. Lambert was active in various community organizations, always quick to attend neighborhood meetings with a warm smile. They were the type of family that other families aspired to be, wealthy, respected, seemingly perfect. But Derek wasn't blind. He knew that their friendly smiles were often followed by side-eye glances when they thought no one was watching. He had seen the way they looked at him, the quiet judgment in their eyes. It wasn't just Derek they looked down on. It was his entire family. And the worst part? They didn't even bother to hide it. The tension had been building for weeks, maybe months. The subtle things that started to add up. The moments when Mr. Lambert would accidentally drop a comment about how nice it was to see a young man like Derek doing well, or how well-behaved his family seemed. The smile on his face never reached his eyes. The whispering when he passed by, the way the Lamberts always seemed to be watching from their front window whenever he came home from school. Derek wasn't sure what they expected him to do, but he knew that it was never going to be enough. Despite the tension, Derek had his own little world, a space he could escape to when the stress of it all became too much. He loved writing, stories, poems, anything he could use to channel his thoughts into something tangible. He spent hours in his room scribbling ideas down in a battered notebook, trying to make sense of the complex world around him. Writing gave him an outlet, a way to process the emotions he couldn't always share with his parents. It was in those moments of quiet creativity that Derek felt the most like himself, free from judgment, free from the world outside. His best friend, Jamal, often joked that Derek's imagination was his superpower. Jamal was the type of friend who always had his back no matter what. They'd spent countless hours hanging out in Derek's room, sharing their dreams, making plans for the future. It was Jamal who convinced Derek to take his passion for writing more seriously. "You've got something, man," Jamal would say. "Don't let the world make you forget that." And yet, the more Derek pursued his dreams, the more he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The pressure to prove himself, the fear that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how well-behaved he was, there would always be someone out there ready to judge him based on nothing but his skin color. He wasn't naive. He knew that the world wasn't always kind to people like him, but he tried to ignore it, tried to push past it. Still, the constant tension, the knowing glances, the whispers, all of it began to wear on him. But Derek wasn't the only one carrying the burden. His mother, Marissa, had her own battles. She worked tirelessly to support her family, but her job as a nurse at a busy hospital often left her exhausted. Derek admired her strength, but he could see the toll it took on her, the way she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. His father, Malik, too, fought an invisible battle. He was well respected by his colleagues, but there were always moments when Derek saw his father's eyes cloud over, as if the world outside had just become too much for him to bear. He never spoke of it, but Derek could feel it. The pressure to keep their family intact, to shield them from the harsh realities of the world they lived in. In the quiet corners of their home, Derek often wondered if things would ever change. Would he always have to carry the burden of proving himself to people who would never see him for who he truly was? Would the Lamberts ever accept him? Or would they forever see him as an outsider? But as the days passed, the tension began to grow. More stares, more whispers, more quiet accusations. And what Derek didn't know yet, what no one could have predicted, was that the breaking point was closer than he realized. His world, his quiet, safe corner of the neighborhood, was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. It began with a simple, innocent gesture. Derek had just finished his last exam of the semester and was walking home from school, head filled with excitement about the upcoming summer break. He didn't think much of it when he noticed the Lamberts standing outside their house, their gaze fixed on him as he passed by. He offered a casual wave, but Mr. Lambert's face was unreadable. Mrs. Lambert only nodded, her lips thin, but Derek chalked it up to another one of those days where people didn't quite know how to react to him. He shrugged it off, but it wasn't just the Lamberts that made Derek uneasy. There had been other moments too. His school, which should have been a sanctuary, had started to feel more like a battleground. Derek had always been a good student, diligent, respectful, and quiet. He made friends, but never too many. There were the occasional classmates who would laugh at his jokes, but there were always the undercurrents of awkwardness, the unsure glances. Some teachers treated him differently too, a bit more cautiously, as if trying to avoid saying the wrong thing, as if his presence in the classroom was something to be managed. That afternoon, however, as Derek walked home, he felt something shift in the air. The familiar, routine sights of Pinebrook Avenue, the smiling neighbors, the friendly greetings, were gone. Something was different. Derek could sense the tension building as he approached his driveway. He noticed the Lamberts once again standing outside their house, only this time, Mr. Lambert had his phone in his hand, his eyes never leaving Derek. Derek's heart began to race. He slowed his pace. Something wasn't right. He stepped onto his porch and was just about to unlock the door when he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. A police cruiser. Derek froze. He turned his head, and to his horror, he saw a uniformed officer stepping out of the car, walking toward his front steps. The Lamberts were standing behind him, their expressions cold and unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" Derek's voice was steady, but his hands were beginning to shake. The officer, a tall man with graying hair and a hard look in his eyes, didn't respond at first. He turned his gaze to the Lamberts as if seeking approval. Mrs. Lambert's lip curled slightly and she spoke up. "We've been concerned about some suspicious activity in the neighborhood. This boy here has been seen around at odd hours, hanging out by parked cars and walking through people's yards. It just doesn't feel right." Her voice was tight, like she was trying to convince herself of something she barely believed. Derek blinked, his mind racing. Suspicious activity? He was about to protest when his mother's voice called out from inside. "Derek, what's going on?" The officer's eyes flickered toward the door. "Ma'am, we've had reports of some unusual behavior from your son, and we're just making sure everything's all right here." His tone wasn't accusatory, but the implication was clear. Marissa stepped outside, still in her nurse's uniform, her tired eyes scanning the situation. She didn't know whether to be worried or confused. What was going on? "Officer," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "I'm not sure what you mean by suspicious behavior, but Derek has been home every day after school. He's never caused trouble." The officer raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Derek could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. It wasn't about a misunderstanding. It wasn't even about the situation itself. It was about how easily they had been willing to accept the Lamberts' accusations, how quickly they believed that he was capable of doing something wrong. Derek's stomach twisted with frustration. He could see the look in the Lamberts' eyes, the silent, unspoken certainty that he didn't belong here, that he was out of place. "We've had a few complaints," Mr. Lambert interjected, his voice tight, almost too polite. "And I think it's better for everyone if we just clear this up." Marissa looked at Derek, her face softening with concern. "Derek, can you explain what happened?" Before he could respond, the officer turned to him, his voice sharp. "You understand the importance of cooperating, right?" He didn't ask a question. It was more of a statement, one that Derek felt deep in his gut. Why was this happening? He hadn't done anything wrong. All he had done was walk home from school like any other teenager. But as the officer's gaze remained fixed on him, Derek's heart sank. This is what it felt like to be accused of. Something you didn't do. Jamal's words echoed in his mind. You can't control how people see you, but you can control how you react to it. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the officer interrupted. "I think it's best if we have a chat down at the station. We'll get everything cleared up." He gestured for Derek to step forward. Marissa's face tightened, a storm of emotions flashing in her eyes. Derek had never seen her look so unsure, so powerless. "Derek?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "Go inside. I'll handle this." But Derek hesitated. He could feel the tension in the air. The Lamberts were watching, their faces unreadable but their presence unmistakably hostile. The officer's patience was wearing thin, and the situation was beginning to feel more like a trap than a simple misunderstanding. "Mom," Derek's voice cracked. "I didn't do anything." "I know," Marissa replied softly, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "But they've made their decision. Just go inside." He wanted to argue, to demand that things be fair, that they see him for who he was, but the reality of the moment pressed down on him. What could he say to make them believe him? What could he do to change their minds? With one last lingering look at his mother, Derek reluctantly stepped inside the house, the door clicking shut behind him. He could hear the muffled voices of his mother and the officer as they continued to talk, but he didn't stay to listen. Instead, he sank down onto the couch, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. Inside, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He could still hear the Lamberts' voices outside, discussing him like he was some sort of threat. The idea that they had called the police over nothing more than their suspicion was too much to bear. He had always known they didn't like him, but he had never imagined it would come to this. As Derek sat there, his mind spinning, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jamal. "Yo, what's going on? I heard something about cops. You good?" Derek didn't know how to respond. How could he explain to Jamal that everything he'd been worried about had just become a reality? The assumption, the judgment, the fear, it was all crashing down at once, and all he could do was sit there, powerless. The moments felt like hours. Derek sat on the couch, staring at the walls, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't catch. The silence in the house was suffocating. His mother was still outside with the officer, and the faint sound of their voices seemed to drift in from the porch. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. The conversation wasn't going well. Every now and then, Derek heard his mother's voice, steady and firm, but there was a subtle crack in her tone that sent waves of panic through him. What was happening out there? The weight of the world pressed down on him. Every insult, every glance, every judgment they'd cast on him over the years was crashing into him now. He had tried to prove himself, to show that he was no different from anyone else, but now it felt like all his efforts were meaningless. It didn't matter that he was a good student, that he worked hard, or that he cared about his family. None of that mattered when all they saw was the color of his skin. A knock at the door made him jump. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, moving slowly toward the door, hoping it was his mother, hoping that she would come in and tell him it was all going to be okay. But when he opened the door, it wasn't his mother standing there. It was Mr. Lambert. Derek's stomach twisted. The man's face was cold, his eyes sharp, as if he had just won some battle. Derek felt the urge to slam the door in his face, but restrained himself, his hand gripping the doorknob with force. "Is your mother home?" Mr. Lambert's voice was clipped, almost too polite. "She's outside," Derek replied, his voice a little shakier than he wanted it to be. Mr. Lambert didn't respond right away. He just stared at Derek for a moment, as if studying him, looking for something to confirm the assumptions he had made. Derek could feel the weight of his gaze, a pressure that made him want to shrink away. "Look, Derek," Mr. Lambert continued after a moment, his tone soft but heavy with something unspoken. "We're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. We've been hearing things, and honestly, you can't blame us for being cautious." He paused. "You know how things have been?" Derek's blood boiled. He clenched his fists, the tension in his body reaching a breaking point. "You think I'm a threat?" he asked, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. "Because of who I am." Mr. Lambert's expression flickered for just a second, a brief, almost imperceptible crack in his carefully constructed mask, before it returned to its usual cold neutrality. "I'm not saying that, Derek, but people talk, and when there's suspicion, well, people tend to act." The words hit him like a slap to the face. People talk. It wasn't about what he had done. It was about the fear they felt. Fear of the unknown. Fear of someone who didn't fit their mold. It wasn't just the Lamberts. It was everyone who looked at him and saw a threat before they even knew his name. Derek felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to change their minds? Nothing. "Just stay out of trouble, Derek," Mr. Lambert added, his voice lower now as if the encounter had drained him too. "We just want what's best for this neighborhood." The coldness of Mr. Lambert's words hung in the air long after he turned and walked away, leaving Derek standing at the door. The door slammed shut behind him, and Derek stood there for a moment, fighting the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. It was too much. Everything was too much. The weight of Mr. Lambert's accusations, the knowledge that this could turn into something much bigger, something that could spiral out of control. His mind raced as he thought of the officer still outside, of his mother, who had been put in this position because of an unfounded fear. And then, it happened. A voice broke through his thoughts, a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "Derek?" It was his mother's voice, but there was something in it that made him freeze. It wasn't the calm, confident tone she usually carried. This time, her voice trembled. He whipped around to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "Derek, the officer said they might need to take you in for questioning." Her voice cracked on the words. He thinks you might have been involved in some sort of incident last night." The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut. Take him in? His world seemed to collapse. What? He shouted, his voice shaking. For what? Some kind of break-in, she explained, her voice distant, as if she were trying to process the situation herself. They said someone saw you walking near a neighbor's house and they're going to check surveillance footage. Derek, they're looking for any excuse to make this more than it is. He felt the room closing in on him, his heart hammering in his chest. But I didn't do anything. I was at home last night. You know that. His mother stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. He could feel the weight of her worry pressing down on him. I know, baby, I know. I'll do everything I can to make sure they know the truth. But you have to stay calm. You have to trust me. Tears burned the back of Derek's eyes, but he swallowed them down. He couldn't break down now. He couldn't let the Lamberts or the officer or anyone else see him as weak. He had to stay strong. I didn't do anything, he said quietly, more to himself than to his mother. The doorbell rang again and his heart dropped into his stomach. The officer was back. His mother turned toward the door, but Derek gripped her arm, his voice low and fierce. Mom, please, don't let them take me. I won't, she whispered, pulling him into her arms once more. I won't let them. The door creaked open. The officer stepped inside, and Derek could feel his gaze on him once more. The air between them was thick with tension. Ma'am, the officer said, his tone no longer soft but authoritative. I'm afraid we'll need Derek to come with us. There's evidence that suggests he was involved in something last night, and we're just following protocol. Derek's mind raced, but before he could say anything, his mother stepped forward, standing tall between him and the officer. No, she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. This is enough. My son is not a criminal. He has done nothing wrong, and you have no right to drag him into your accusations without proof. The officer hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Ma'am, we have every right. Not without evidence, she interrupted, her voice rising. You cannot just assume someone is guilty based on nothing. You've done enough damage today. There was a long, tense silence. Derek held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. And then something shifted. The officer looked at Derek, and for the first time his gaze softened, just a little. We'll need to follow through with our investigation, he said. But his tone had lost some of its edge. He turned toward the door. But I'll make sure you're not inconvenienced any longer than necessary. As the officer stepped back onto the porch, Derek's world began to shift. The immediate crisis wasn't over, but in that moment, something had changed. His mother had stood up for him, not just as a mother, but as a fierce protector, refusing to let him be swept up in the tide of others' prejudices. She had made a choice to fight, and in doing so, she had given Derek a reason to fight too. As the officer's car pulled away, Derek felt a weight lift from his chest. There was still a long road ahead, the uncertainty, the judgment, but in that moment, standing in the doorway, Derek knew he was not alone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The days that followed felt like a blur of confusion, frustration, and quiet dread. Derek could hardly believe what had happened. It had felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, making every breath harder to take. The incident with the police, the accusations, the judgment, it was all so overwhelming. But slowly, a sense of resolve began to settle in his chest. It was a subtle shift, almost unnoticeable at first, but it was there. A growing conviction that he wasn't going to let this define him. He wasn't going to let fear and hatred take away his voice, his identity, or his future. His mother's strength had become his anchor. She had stood up to the officer that day, not just for him, but for the very idea of justice. She had refused to let them paint him as a criminal without evidence, without any real cause. And in doing so, she had not only fought for Derek's innocence, but had reminded him of the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. But the fight wasn't over. Derek knew that. The Lamberts, for one, hadn't stopped watching. They had their suspicions, their unfounded fears, and Derek could feel them in the air every time he walked past their house. Their presence weighed on him like a shadow he couldn't shake. It wasn't just their looks or their whispered comments when they thought he wasn't paying attention. It was the way they made him feel, as though he wasn't truly welcome in his own neighborhood. And yet, despite everything, Derek began to feel a sense of empowerment rise within him. He was no longer going to shrink into the background. He wasn't going to let people define him based on a stereotype. He knew, now that he had a voice, and he wasn't afraid to use it. It all came to a head on a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon, a week after the police had come to his house. Derek had decided that he wasn't going to let fear rule his life anymore. He was going to speak out, to make sure that the Lamberts and everyone in the neighborhood knew who he truly was. He wasn't going to stand silently in the corner while they spread their toxic assumptions. That afternoon, he walked up to their house, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the front door. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. He had to confront the people who had called the police on him, who had put his family through this unnecessary nightmare. The doorbell rang, and Derek held his breath. Moments later, Mrs. Lambert answered, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him standing on her doorstep. "Derek," she said, her voice cautious, "what are you doing here?" "I came to talk," Derek replied, his voice steady, but there was a fire in his eyes. "I need you to understand something." Mrs. Lambert didn't step aside, but she didn't slam the door in his face either. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What's there to talk about?" "I'm not the person you think I am," Derek said, his voice calm but forceful. "I'm not a threat. I'm a good kid. I'm a student. I'm part of this community, and I don't deserve to be treated like this." Mrs. Lambert opened her mouth to respond, but Derek continued before she could speak. "You don't know me. You don't know my life, my struggles, or what I've been through. You only saw me walking down the street and you assumed I was doing something wrong. But that's not who I am. And I'm not going to let you, or anyone, make me feel less than what I am." Mrs. Lambert stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line as Derek's words hung in the air. He could see her struggle. The walls she had built around her were starting to crack, but she wasn't ready to let them fall yet. Derek didn't expect an immediate apology. He didn't even expect understanding, but he had to say his piece. He couldn't let this moment slip by without speaking the truth. "I don't know what happened to you or why you're so scared of people who are different," Derek continued, his voice growing stronger. "But fear isn't an excuse for treating people like criminals. It isn't an excuse for spreading hate and suspicion where there's nothing to back it up. We all have to do better. We all have to make this place better. For everyone, not just the people who look like us." There was a long silence, and for a brief moment, Derek wondered if Mrs. Lambert would slam the door in his face. But instead, she simply stood there, her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Uncertainty, maybe even a hint of guilt. The silence between them stretched on, but Derek didn't back down. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was softer, now almost regretful. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," she admitted. "But I guess I never thought about it that way. I've been so scared of what I don't understand." Derek's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of relief. This was the turning point. She wasn't fully there yet, but she was listening. And that was a start. "I get it," Derek said quietly. "It's easy to be scared of things we don't understand. But we can't let fear control us. We can't let it turn us against each other." Mrs. Lambert nodded, her expression softening. "I'm sorry for what happened," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have taken the time to talk to you. I should have tried to understand you better instead of jumping to conclusions." Derek felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This wasn't the grand, dramatic apology he had expected, but it was enough. He didn't need her to change overnight. He just needed her to see him for who he really was. A person, not a stereotype. "I'll make it right," she added, her voice quieter now. "I'll talk to the officer and I'll make sure they know it was a mistake. This shouldn't have gone as far as it did." Derek nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. The journey wasn't over, and there would still be challenges ahead. But this moment felt like a victory, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been judged or misunderstood because of their appearance. As he walked away from the Lambert house, Derek felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim of their fears. He was someone who could challenge those fears, who could speak the truth and make a difference, even if it was in small steps. Later that night, as Derek sat at the dinner table with his mother, they talked about what had happened. She listened intently as he told her about the conversation with Mrs. Lambert, and though she was still wary of how things would play out in the future, she couldn't help but smile. "You did good, Derek," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You stood up for yourself. You spoke your truth." Derek smiled back, but it was a quiet smile. One that said there was still work to be done, that this wasn't the end of the story. But it was a start. And sometimes that's all it takes. A single step, a single voice, to begin to shift the narrative. To make people realize that they are more than their fears, more than their assumptions. Derek knew that the fight for justice and understanding was far from over, but in that moment he felt a spark of hope, a belief that things could change, even if it was just one person at a time. The story of Derek and the events that unfolded in his neighborhood is a powerful illustration of the systemic issues that affect marginalized communities, particularly Black people, in societies around the world. What may seem like a personal conflict between an innocent teen and his prejudiced neighbors is, in fact, a reflection of a much deeper societal issue. The persistent and often invisible force of racial bias, the dangerous effects of stereotypes, and the profound impact of systemic racism. While Derek's story is one of personal triumph, it also highlights the pervasive struggles faced by countless individuals every day. Struggles that are not simply confined to one neighborhood or one individual. The prejudices that lead to his being wrongly suspected of a crime are part of a broader historical pattern of discrimination that stretches back centuries. From slavery and segregation to modern-day racial profiling and mass incarceration, the systems that marginalize Black people have long been entrenched in the fabric of society. In order to understand the full scope of the issues Derek's story raises, it's important to reflect on the larger patterns of racism and its impact on both individual lives and entire communities. The power of stereotypes and prejudices. The first major theme explored in the narrative is the danger of stereotypes and the ways in which prejudice seeps into everyday interactions. From the moment the Lamberts see Derek, they are unable to view him as an individual. Instead, they view him through the lens of racial stereotypes, assumptions about what Black people are capable of, what they deserve, and what they are likely to do. These stereotypes are built on centuries of cultural conditioning, where Black bodies are often seen as dangerous, threatening, or inferior. These assumptions don't just emerge out of nowhere. They are fed by media portrayals, historical narratives, and societal attitudes that dehumanize Black people and perpetuate racial divisions. Stereotypes are not just harmful to the individuals they target, but to society as a whole. They perpetuate inequality by dictating who gets the benefit of the doubt and who is treated with suspicion. In Derek's case, it's the presumption that because he is Black, he is somehow more likely to be involved in criminal activity. The damage done by such assumptions is not just emotional or psychological, it's material and structural. It shapes the opportunities that individuals are given, the treatment they receive in schools, the likelihood of their being stopped by the police, and even the way they are treated in their own communities. The power of stereotypes extends beyond just isolated encounters. It informs public policy, policing, education, and employment practices. The over-policing of Black communities, the disproportionate number of Black individuals in the criminal justice system, and the economic disparities that persist all stem from a deep-seated bias that continues to permeate society. Historical context of stereotyping and discrimination. To understand the depth of the issue Derek faces, it's important to place his experience within the broader historical context of racial discrimination. In the United States, for example, the history of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and segregation created a foundation for racial biases that still affect Black people today. The civil rights movement of the 1960s fought for equality and the dismantling of institutionalized racism, but the fight is far from over. Despite the legal victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, racial inequalities persist, especially in areas like law enforcement, education, housing, and healthcare. The war on drugs, which began in the 1980s, is a stark example of how systemic racism continues to harm Black communities. Even though Black people and white people use drugs at roughly the same rates, Black individuals are far more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to prison time. This systemic racial profiling and the disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans reinforce the very stereotypes that Derek experiences, that Black people are inherently dangerous or criminal. The theme of fear is another important aspect of the story. Mrs. Lambert's reaction to Derek, though more subdued than the overt hostility of her husband, is rooted in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the unfamiliar, and fear of difference. Fear is a powerful emotion that can distort perceptions, leading people to make irrational judgments about others. In the case of racism, fear is often fueled by a lack of understanding and a history of division. Fear breeds distance, and distance breeds distrust. Racial fear is not unique to one community, nor is it the result of simple ignorance. It is a structural force that has been cultivated for centuries, driven by historical narratives that portray Black people as other, as outside the realm of safety and normalcy. This fear is often justified by harmful stereotypes and misinformation. When people are taught to fear those who are different, they build walls that keep them from seeing the humanity in others. In this story, Derek's mother confronts this fear directly when she stands up to the officer and refuses to let him take Derek without proof. It's a powerful moment that challenges the assumption that Black people should be automatically feared and suspected. But even as Mrs. Lambert begins to recognize the truth of Derek's words, that fear cannot justify discrimination, the process of overcoming fear is slow. It's not something that happens in a single conversation, nor is it something that one person can change overnight. Fear is a societal construct that requires collective effort to dismantle. Insights from cultural leaders and experts. Cultural leaders and social justice activists have long spoken out against the damaging effects of racial stereotypes and the importance of understanding and empathy in dismantling prejudice. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." His words resonate today because they remind us that racism is not just an individual problem, but a societal one. It is not enough for Derek to simply have a single positive encounter with Mrs. Lambert. The change that needs to happen is larger and more systematic. Today, leaders like Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, continue to push for a shift in how we view and confront racism. Kendi argues that racism is not just about personal prejudice, but is embedded in policies and structures. To be truly anti-racist, one must actively oppose and dismantle these structures. It's not enough to not be racist. One must be actively anti-racist. Similarly, organizations like the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, and others continue to fight for systemic change. They call for reforms in policing, education, healthcare, and housing, areas where Black people face disproportionate inequality. While Derek's story represents one individual's fight for justice, it is also part of a larger movement to address these disparities. Derek's story is just one example of the larger fight for racial equality and justice that is happening all around the world. While he found the strength to confront his personal challenge, the broader issues of systemic racism and prejudice require collective action. Through education, reform, empathy, and personal accountability, we can work together to build a society where everyone, regardless of their race or background, is treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Only when we face these issues head-on and commit to true change can we begin to undo the harm that has been done and create a world where people like Derek are no longer seen as threats, but as human beings deserving of the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. As Derek stood in that moment, shaking with fear yet filled with an undeniable sense of justice, he didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every Black child who had ever been judged before their story could even begin, for every person of color whose humanity had been reduced to a stereotype. What Derek did in that painful moment of injustice was take the first step toward reclaiming his dignity, his power, and his right to simply be. But Derek's story doesn't end with just one victory. It's a call to action for all of us. It's a challenge to look at the world around us and ask ourselves, what can I do to help make it better? Each of us has a responsibility to break down the barriers of fear, bias, and division that keep us from truly seeing each other as we are, human. Derek's encounter with the Lamberts, with their judgment, their prejudice, their deep-seated fear, is not just his story, it's our story. It's a story that has been written time and time again throughout history, but it's a story that we have the power to rewrite. This is not just about Black people. This is not just about one community or one group. This is about all of us. Because the truth is, we all lose when we allow fear to rule our hearts. We all lose when we allow stereotypes to dictate our thoughts and actions. We all lose when we stand by silently while injustice unfolds. So, what can you do today? What action can you take to be part of the change? Speak up. The first step is awareness. If you see someone being treated unfairly, speak up. It doesn't matter if it's a small encounter or a big one. Every voice matters. When we stay silent, we allow injustice to continue. Don't be afraid to use your voice, especially when it's most needed. Derek stood up for himself, but he also needed people who were willing to stand with him. Challenge your own biases. We all carry biases, some conscious, others unconscious. These biases influence the way we see and treat others, often without us realizing it. Take a moment to reflect on your own biases. Ask yourself, how do I see the world? What assumptions do I make about people based on their race, background, or appearance? We all have room to grow. Educating ourselves and confronting these biases is the first step toward creating a more equal society. Support change. True change comes from collective action. Support organizations that are working to fight systemic racism and inequality. Whether it's through donating your time, resources, or simply your voice, every effort matters. This fight isn't just for today, it's for the future. When we come together, we can make a real difference. Practice empathy. It's easy to feel disconnected from struggles that aren't our own, but the power of empathy is transformative. It allows us to see the world through someone else's eyes and experience their pain, their joy, and their hopes. Practice listening to others' stories, especially those from communities that have been marginalized. Empathy is the key that unlocks understanding and change. Stand for justice and equality. At the heart of everything Derek went through was one simple truth. He deserved justice. He deserved to be seen for who he truly was, not for what others assumed him to be. We must all stand for justice, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard, when it's uncomfortable, when we have to push against the systems that have been built to keep some people down while others rise. In a world where injustice and inequality still run deep, it's easy to feel helpless, but the truth is we are powerful. Every single one of us. Every choice we make, every word we speak, every act of kindness, of understanding, of courage, it all matters. Derek didn't give up, and neither can we. We have the power to break down the walls that divide us. We have the power to stop the cycle of hatred and fear. Together we can create a world where every person is treated with dignity, where every child can walk through their neighborhood without fear, and where the next generation grows up in a world that knows equality, kindness, and justice. This isn't just a story, it's a movement, and it starts with you. So, let's take a stand. Let's challenge the narratives that divide us. Let's fight for a world that embraces diversity, justice, and equality for all. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How will you contribute to making this world a better place? What steps are you taking to fight against racism and injustice in your own life? Together, we can be the change. Together, we can rewrite the story. Because justice, equality, and kindness are worth fighting for.